meeting number 27 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, June 18, 2020, the committee is meeting on the subject of frontline grocery store workers. Today's meeting is taking place by video conference, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. I'd like to remind the members and the witnesses, before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, please unmute your microphone and then return to mute when you are finished speaking. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly so that the translators can do their work. Please make sure that your interpretation is on the language in which you are speaking. As is my normal practice, I will hold up a yellow card for when you have 30 seconds left in your intervention, and I will hold up the red card for when your time has expired. I will now like to welcome our witnesses. From Teamsters Canada, Stéphane Lacroix, Director of Communication and Public Affairs in Quebec. From Unifor, Jerry Dias, National President, Carolyn Rice, President Local 597, and Gord Curry, President Local 414. And from the United Food and Commercial Workers Union Canada, Mr. Paul Minema, National President. Each witness will have 5 minutes to present, followed by the rounds of questions. With that, we will start with Mr. Lacroix. Vous avez 5 minutes.
You have 5 minutes.
Mr. Lacroix. Good day. Thank you for the invitation to participate in the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology. First of all, a quick reminder about the Teamsters Union. We represent more than 125,000 workers in Canada in all industries that are crucial to the Canadian society. In the retail and grocery sector, we defend the interests of several thousand workers from one end of the country to the other. For the Teamsters Union, the COVID-19 premium paid to grocery store workers was greatly appreciated. However, the withdrawal of this bonus sends a contradictory message to workers whose wages are largely insufficient to help them live and prosper. Before I go any further in my reflections, I would like to take a little trip back in time to give you a quick snapshot of the situation in this industry. First, I must say that I worked in this industry for 11 years. In the 80s and 90s, I worked as a cashier. I have fond memories of that time, but I knew very well that I wasn't going to make a career of it. The salaries were not bad when you went up the ladder, but the social benefits and pension plans were not enough because I wanted to start a family, buy a house and a car. In short, this industry did not allow me to realize my dreams. For people of my generation, the X generation, working in a grocery store was considered a low-valued job. So I made a decision to go back to school. Then I was hired by the Teamsters, who increased my salary significantly. And you can see the difference between retail trade, groceries, and the unionized world. Now let's move forward to the 2000s. At that time, I sat as a Teamsters Canada representative and the Canadian Food Industry Council. This organization is made up of representatives of major grocery stores and unions, and our intention was to restore the industry's reputation in order to attract new talent. The retention issues were exactly the same at the time as in the 90s. Inadequate salaries, poor promotion opportunities, low job value, an unattractive pension plan, and inadequate group insurance. So here we are in 2020, and the decision is made to withdraw the COVID-19 bonus from grocery workers under the pretext that the pandemic is over, which is not the case, by the way. It was pointed out to me that it's not uncommon to observe that workers with more than 10 years of seniority earn barely more than the minimum wage, at least the minimum wage in Quebec. An example, one of our members comes to mind. After 10 years of good and loyal service, she earns barely $14 an hour in a large grocery store chain. So I'm wondering, can we live decently on $25,000 a year? In 2020, I am asking the question. I don't think so. So I went back 30 years just to make you understand that issues we face in this industry are not limited to the $2 an hour premium. For COVID-19, I think we all agree that the pandemic has highlighted how important these workers are to their fellow citizens. So we believe that these men and women deserve more. We recommend that the risk premium be permanently integrated into the salaries, and we must also significantly improve pension plans and group insurance. These men and women have done more than their share to ensure the well-being of the population. So I think we should return the favor. Once again, thank you for the invitation. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Unifor, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor today to appear before the House of Commons, the Standing Committee on the Needy and the Greedy. Starting with the needy, the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workers in the retail sector across this country that lost their $2 pandemic pay as a result of the greedy. Starting with Metro, starting with Sobeys, and of course with Loblaws and Galen Weston and his personal wealth of $8.7 billion. I want to say to Galen Weston today, you should be ashamed of yourself. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Jerry Dias, the National President of Unifor, Canada's largest union in the private sector. Unifor represents 315,000 workers, including thousands on the front line in this pandemic. That includes transit workers, telecommunications workers, food processors, health and long-term care workers, and of course, the retail workers. More than 20,000 Unifor members work in supermarkets, pharmacies, and food distribution centers across the country at Loblaws, Sobeys, Metros, Rexall, and others. I am joined today by Carolyn Rice, a supermarket worker for Loblaws in St. John's and president of Unifor Local 597, and Gord Curry, a food warehouse worker in Toronto and president of Unifor Local 414. I speak for both Carolyn and Gord when I say our union is proud of the workers who bravely and selfishly stepped up during this pandemic. We also want to thank this committee for taking quick action to pull together this hearing together. It is a matter of national interest of Canada's biggest retailers, in fact, conspired to cut pandemic pay premiums for its workers. In March, I applauded these same retailers for establishing enhanced pay protections for workers who were off sick or in quarantine. Shortly after, these same retailers unveiled wage enhancements, which totaled about $2 extra per hour. This move made good sense. On the one hand, it recognized the enormous safety risks these workers were taking by going to work. On the other hand, and let's be frank here, it recognized that the majority of these workers earned very low wages. Who in the right mind would risk contracting COVID, in some cases, for $11.32 an hour? The sad truth is, wages and benefits of retail workers have suffered a downward spiral over the past 30 years. At one point, not long ago, a supermarket job was a ticket to the middle class. Now, most supermarket work is part-time. In some discount stores, for instance, 90% of all jobs are part-time. These folks mostly earn minimum wage, and most of those minimum wage workers are women. They have no set schedules. Many can't access benefits. Despite this, retailers are consolidating, getting richer. They are turning out record profits, increasing shareholder dividends, doling out huge executive bonuses. Last year alone, Loblaws, Empire, Metro together cranked out $2 billion in bottom line after-tax net profits. Loblaws CEO Sarah Davis took home $6.7 million in total compensation. Yet frontline workers are barely scraping by, some working multiple jobs, others leaning on food banks. This is the tragedy underlining today's discussion. Unfortunately, I can't provide you with any concrete proof of collusion. But to be candid, that's besides the point. The fact is, this pandemic is not over. COVID cases continue to mount for workers in essential retail shops and warehouses, including in uniform. Just last week, Canada's public health officer told the Senate committee to prepare for a possible return, an even bigger wave of COVID at any time. The fact is, too, that workers deserve better. Do I think big grocers reverse course and reinstate those pay premiums? Damn right I do. In fact, some smaller retailers have committed to keeping them in place. Do I think this fixes the rampant inequality in the industry? Absolutely not. What is needed is a permanent readjustment, a realignment of wages to equal pay, to scheduling protections, to benefit access. I encourage you to consider this in your final report. And I encourage you to recommend a more sweeping committee study of declining working conditions in the retail industry. I can't imagine us having the same conversation a generation ago. What we're dealing with today is an outcome of neglect and lack of oversight about declining work standards and inadequate labor laws. Let's not waste this moment to get at the heart of this problem. Thank you. Carolyn, Gord, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diaz. And I'm just going to remind you, when we come to the questions, if you can put your mic closer to your mouth. It's okay. We were able to hear you.
Okay, will do.
Next, we will move to Mr. Mainamera. Yeah, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on behalf of the United Food and Commercial Workers, I want to thank the Standing Committee for the opportunity to share our perspective today and for your work on this subject and for bringing further attention to this very important issue. As the Union for Canada's grocery store workers, we certainly have a number of thoughts on this topic. We're a private sector union who represents more than 160,000 grocery store workers across the country. We also represent a further 100,000 Canadians and folks aspiring to be Canadians who work in many other key sectors and other industries. But as our name suggests, the majority of our membership is directly connected to the food sector. Long story short, UFCW members work hard day in and day out to proudly feed Canadians. And as the national leader of Canada's Food Workers Union, I am both proud and concerned that our members have continued to do what they've always done through this current pandemic. Despite the clear and present risks to themselves and their families, UFCW Canada members have stepped up. They've stepped up like the frontline heroes that they've always been to help their neighbors, their country, and all of us get through this difficult time. As a result, hundreds of UFCW Canada members have fallen ill. And yes, some have died, including a father of 4, a beloved grandmother, and a young cashier with her whole life still ahead of her. The current pandemic has resulted in one positive for our frontline workers. It is the recognition that they are now receiving for the crucial work that they're doing from the general public, from public officials as yourself, and the Prime Minister, no less. This recognition of grocery workers is certainly welcome, but quite frankly, is overdue. For food workers, the premium pay is appreciated from a financial standpoint, but it's also an important symbol. It represents a heightened level of respect and acknowledgement that has long eluded this industry and the hardworking people who make it possible. As their union, we are extremely disappointed in the decisions by Canada's largest retailers and other food companies to cancel these premiums. It doesn't make sense to cancel pandemic pay when we are still experiencing a pandemic situation. And more than that, it's simply not fair. In response, UFCW has filed grievances over this issue. We have launched a national campaign to engage the public over the cancellation of pandemic pay. And we're currently at the bargaining table with our major employers to negotiate the wage increases that these food workers so desperately deserve. The fact of the matter is that this so-called premium pay must become permanent. Every Canadian has a vested interest in making sure that food workers are treated and compensated fairly. That said, I must add that safeguarding the health and safety of our UFW Canada members and their families is a top priority. We're calling on both unionized and non-union food employers to adopt a set of standards that we have detailed with the industry and the federal government. We've made some progress on this front, but there's still much to do. I'd be happy to share and provide this information to the members of the committee. And while we welcome these hearings, I am curious as to why only Canadian grocers have been called to give presentations. I think the public would benefit from hearing from huge transnationals who operate in this space who canceled their premiums a long time earlier. And I would conclude my remarks by suggesting that greater corporate responsibility is only a part of the solution here. That broader action from all levels of government and legislative policy reform that strike a better balance between grocery workers and their corporate leaders is just as essential. Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and the honorable members of this committee, and it will be my pleasure to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to our round of questions, and a gentle reminder to our witnesses that if you do not have a headset, it's really important that you put the little microphone closer to your mouth so that the interpreters can do the work that they need to do. With that, I'll move to MP Rempel-Garner. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And maybe I'll be directing my questions to all the witnesses, and I'll just start by saying this might be a rare day where I hope that Conservatives and union leaders can agree on things, because I have to say, I mean, watching this unfold, we are asking ourselves a fairly significant question as a country right now, which is how do we pay people who are providing food to a population that's on lockdown during the middle of a pandemic when we're asking people to put themselves and their families in danger of the very thing that we're locking ourselves out against? And I don't think that we've answered that question very well, frankly. And I think that I have to commend my colleague, Mr. Erskine Smith, for taking the initiative on this particular study, because we've got to get this right. So, I'm going to start my questions just by asking some exploratory what happened questions from your perspective. So I know in the middle of April, my colleagues, we had put out a statement calling upon the government to issue guidelines, at a bare minimum guidelines for personal protective equipment for various industries across the country, so that could be part of the planning process for distribution and prioritization of PPE. Were you contacted by the government as union leaders at any point over the last couple of months in terms of developing guidelines and or suggesting standards by which employers should be providing PPE or PPE secured environments for workers in the grocery sector? And maybe I'll start with Mr. Diaz.
Mr. Diaz, you're still on mute.
Got it. First of all, Michelle, thank you very much for your question. And you're right. It's at times like this, I'm pleased that there's moderate conservatives that are looking at a discussion about workers as opposed to profits. So I welcome your question. And on the question, has the government been in contact with myself or the leadership about the issue of personal protective equipment for retail workers? The answer is no. The facts are, is when the pandemic hit, as a nation, we were caught literally completely unprepared because we outsourced all of our security. And when it came to the distribution of personal protective equipment, it was really broken down in chronological order, where you started with doctors and nurses and then worked your way down the healthcare system where PSWs were last. And then grocery store workers and others who were deemed essential workers came afterwards. So as it came to the distribution of personal protective equipment, grocery store workers, unfortunately, were down on the totem pole.
And maybe just for time's sake, I'll just stick with you, Mr. Diaz. Are you finding right now that most of your workers are having to provide their PPE at their own cost, or is it being provided in the context of grocery store workers by the corporations?
No, the masks clearly and much of the protective equipment are being provided now by the employers. but it was incredibly difficult in the beginning because of the raw shortage. But I think you'll find that one of the ironies of this is as you walk into a Sobeys, Metros, Loblaws, they're now giving everybody that walks in masks, understanding that the pandemic is still alive and well, yet they, as CEOs, behave otherwise.
The other thing that I'm just going to quote from the article, I saw that Loblaws, they're touting, they're saying that they're going to spend $25 million on a one-time bonus for workers. And the calculation is approximately $140 per person for workers on a full-time schedule. That's according to your estimate. Like I guess I'll just give you a chance to expound on that. Do you think that that's adequate for the compensation for the situation that some of the workers have been put in over the last several months?
No, first of all, it's absolutely ridiculous. We would never agree to end the pandemic pay. We have never agreed to a minuscule lump sum. The reality is the pandemic is alive and well. And if you look at the grocery stores, their profits have increased significantly during the pandemic. If you take a look at their income from 2019 to 2020, it went up during the pandemic. So once again, this is strictly, Michelle, about greed.
So, and I'm sorry to cut you off, I've just got a minute left. And I want to ask this. I know that the government is looking at the structure of the CERB. And you mentioned that many workers are in part-time situations. Yeah. Are you hearing anything anecdotally from your labor force, the people that you represent, basically saying, look, I can only work up to $1,000. I'm not getting PPE. I'm in a really what I feel is a dangerous situation. I'm just not going to work. I'm just going to take the CERB. Like how can we, what's a recommendation you would make in that scenario? And are you hearing that?
Well, first of all, one of the main reasons I will argue that they gave the $2 is because it would have been beneficial for workers to be on CERB than going to work. But they went to work out of their commitment. But B, look, the $2 can't go away. That's strictly it. But the recommendations has to be more full-time job, better pay. This whole precarious part-time non-standards is ridiculous.
Okay. Anything else that you want to say just in the last 10 seconds that I have on this in terms of like number one recommendation?
The number one recommendation has to be to make sure that there's full-time jobs coming out of this sector. There has to be an easier mechanism for workers to organize.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Johari. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to start by specifically thanking all the union's members, all the grocery and retail stores employees who stayed open, active, and put themselves, their family, in the front line as we pulled back, stayed home, and we wanted to make sure that we also have the security of the food, whereas they were in the front line. And I'm glad that in some ways we managed to be able to give them the benefit, however short-lived. However, I just want to personally thank on behalf of myself, I believe all my team members, as well as our government. Thank you very much. You were instrumental. Your members were instrumental getting us to this stage, and I'm sure they remain instrumental. Having said that, I've heard a lot about pandemic is not over. So why is that pandemic acknowledgement fee of $2 per hour is being cut back? So I'm going to start by reading a statement that came from the Loblaws Chief Executive Officer, and I'd like to get some feedback from all of you around why would they make the statements if we believe that the pandemic is not over. So the statement from 11th of July 2020 from Loblaws Chief Executive Officer reads, "Finally, as the economy slowly reopens and the Canadian begin to return to work, we believe it's the right time to end the temporary pay permit we introduced at the beginning of the pandemic. Things have now stabilized on our market and on supermarkets and drugstores. After extending the premium multiple times, we are confident our colleagues now are operating on the safe and effectively a new normal." So I'm going to pause. I don't want to read the rest because I want to give you guys an opportunity. So Mr. Diaz, let's start with you. Do you believe that now the pandemic is over? And if it's not, what indications are you using? I'm aware of it. I know that I still wear masks, and I know the pandemic is not over, and some provinces we're stage 2. But how could a statement like be made that we are getting back to the normal?
Well, first of all, it's an irresponsible statement by those that know better. They know the amount of employees that are still sick. They know of their employees. Let me just talk about my union. Right now, we have over 20 workers that work in the supermarkets and over 15 that work in the warehouses that are off sick right now with COVID-19. So the first thing they have to do is tell those 30 some odd families, or 35 plus families, that somehow everything is over, because we know it's not. So look, the comments were strictly based on finances, strictly based on greed. It wasn't scientific. I think they're spending too much time watching Fox TV and listening to Donald Trump. The bottom line is, it was an irresponsible statement, not backed by any scientific proof. Science is telling us we're in trouble.
Just a quick question. Has any of the unions, and you remember, were consulted into the fact that the pandemic, as far as the owners are concerned, is over now, we're going to do this, or you just heard it like the rest of us?
No, I heard it like the rest of you. I mean, ultimately, when they moved forward to cut the pandemic pay, we had a hell of a lot to say to them, but it was completely non-negotiable. They wouldn't talk to us about it. They made the decision. We spent a lot of time, in fairness, talking to them about health and safety, about the different procedures and protocols that are in place within our respective workplaces. But when it came to the pandemic pay, there was no consultation with our union at all.
Okay. Mr. Paul Menema from United Food and Commercial, do you want to add something?
No, I think that some of the summaries is very accurate. There is no doubt that the pandemic is not over. I would just like to add a couple of significant issues. That we were contacted by Loblaws to say they were going to end the pandemic pay. We're adamantly opposed to ending the pandemic pay. We made as many issues of it as we could. We also reminded them of the 20 protocols that UFCW Canada was able to put together. We're able to put it together because we're an international union. We called on the best standards from our colleagues and unions in Europe and in South America. And all of these issues would indicate that the pandemic is still ongoing, that pandemic pay should not go. UFCW's call in a letter to the employers at the beginning of April. The letter was also shared with the government, Minister Tassi and Minister Hadou, who we did speak with Minister Tassi on the issue. There's 20 protocols that we asked to be put in place for all retail foods stores, all retailers. And the one of the points on there is very clear, that the pandemic pay must stay, must become permanent, and actually must be increased.
Yeah, I thank you. I got about 30 seconds left, and I really want to hear from the Teamsters Canada. So, Stephen, if you want to close. I believe you're on mute.
Monsieur Lacroix, vous êtes
Excusez-moi.
I'm sorry, Monsieur Lacroix. Yes, I fully agree with the representatives of Unifor and CFU. We know that this pandemic is not over. It's not yet over. So the $2 an hour that was added to the salaries of workers should be and permanently part of the salaries of these workers. So quickly, $25,000 a year is not enough money to live on. Thank you. So the next round is for Mr. Lemire. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I think it's important to mention the absence of this first state, that we don't have any representatives from the employers, the major chains. It would have been relevant to hear their input in this debate. I like the fact that Mr. Lacroix mentioned right at the start that for the Gen Xers and from the 90s, it wasn't considered as such valuable work. In the past, one could actually buy a house with a gross wage, but with $25,000 today, it's impossible to be able to buy a house. So that got me thinking. And I would also like to stress the basic idea, can we integrate these premiums into salaries in a regular way? So a minimum increase in wages for these employments. Because one of the consequences, we see grocery workers as student work, because the working conditions are mostly on a part-time basis, the absence of retirement plans. This seems to be more suitable for students. So it's mostly the middle-class people. So all the planning, the logistics elements are much harder. And I would imagine that for unions like yours, the impact of mobilization will be difficult, trying to have better working conditions for all workers. We must recognize that in the COVID-19 crisis, this is an opportunity to recognize the essential nature of your work, and there is also the issue of dignity for workers. In my region, I had a meeting this morning with the healthcare network in Abitibi-Temiskaming, and they said they've hired 700 people in the region. So the COVID did boost hirings, but most of these hirings were done in a situation where it was for grocery workers, proximity types of businesses. So the groceries couldn't compete with on a salary level. So we must link this premium in a regular way to salaries. So some companies called us and said, yes, our employees are no longer interested in working. First of all, they're putting their lives in danger with COVID, and they will actually earn more money with the SERB. They said it was taxable and then not taxable and back and forth. So this whole situation was very hard for employees and for morale. So as elected people, my question from Mr. Lacroix of the Teamsters, do you think a decree by the government should be brought in to handle the whole situation with the grocery industry? Thank you for your question. I think it's an option that is possible, a better way of handling the working conditions of workers. I'm not really accusing any specific business, but grocery business, retail trade, that whole industry doesn't really want to put in place working conditions that would encourage people to stay within the industry, to attract new talent, to create full-time jobs, to create an economic situation where people could work and earn a living as I would have liked to do in the 90s. At that time, it wasn't really possible, and it still isn't possible. So what the federal government can put in place, it's not really the form that matters. We just want to make sure that the salaries would be good, there would be decent retirement plans. I think that's what really matters. There could be some decree from the government. That works because it brings about more fairness within the businesses. So it's beneficial for private business and workers. Quickly, you spoke about mobilization of workers, but there is a phenomenon we see in the Teamsters. So there is an increased level of mobilization. The members are saying that removing $2 an hour, I've worked hard, I've put my life in danger, my life is still in danger. So I wasn't thinking about a strike 6 months ago, but now I'm considering it because I think that I'm worth more. So we should watch for that over the next few weeks and months. Well, congratulations. You have about a minute. This crisis brought about some of the shortcomings in the industry. What are some of these shortcomings, and what solutions would you propose to make the industry more attractive, the grocery industry? Well, there are problems in relation to working conditions. Let's not get back into that. I think my colleagues from Unifor and the United Workers, they would agree. But I think in terms of the measures, the deployment of measures put in place to face these kinds of situations, this is the first major pandemic we've had in Canada. I don't want to be the prophet of doom, but I have a feeling it's not going to be the last. Thank you, Mr. Lacroix. Thank you. Mr. Lemire, the representatives of the groceries would be here with us Friday during the next meeting of our committee. Thank you.
The floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for our witnesses. And I know it was originally, and maybe this will help clear up how we got here. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Erskine Smith, for bringing forth a motion to having the chains come forward because they were caught with collusion on bread scandal across this country from the Competition Bureau. And then I amended it to include at least some worker representation, but there's no doubt that this issue and this industry deserves more oversight and more activity, and all members have been supportive of that. So we'll see where we go forth, but this is just the first dive at this, for no doubt. First question I have is for UFCW and Unifor with regards to the chain of structures inside both the representative workers you have. I didn't realize, or is this not accurate, that your workers that are, say, for example, at Food Basics versus Metro or No Frills versus Loblaws, they're paid differently. They can be part of the same company, but they're structured so that the basic stores or the ones that are the lower end of the grocery store change in terms of their modeling pay their workers less. Is that true? So maybe I can hear from both those organizations first.
Okay,
so Brian, thank you, Brian, for the opportunity to answer. I think what's important for everyone, and I know that Unifor and Teamsters know this, but what's important for the committee to understand is this.
Sorry, Mr. Minema, can I ask you to hold your microphone closer?
My apologies.
Thank you.
Yeah. What's important for everyone to understand, as I said, the Teamsters and Unifor are aware of this as well, is that the current situation that we find ourselves in with grocery store workers, and Mr. Massey, thank you for your question because it will illustrate this, is that the downturn in the value of the work occurred in the late 80s, early 90s with the entrance of multinational Walmart. And what occurred there is, for the first time in Canada, we had a situation of a deep discount, and they paid less, they provide no benefits, and they competed with the larger chains, which have now since consolidated. Gary said earlier, there's been a huge consolidation, but they competed against what we referred to as conventional stores that had meat departments, that had bakeries, and had full service checkout people to take your groceries out to your car. And the new model from Walmart, if you remember, their slogan was always prices, the lowest price is the law, and we're price dropping. So what happened in Canada is we've seen a huge entrance into what they call discount and deep discount stores. Food Basics, No Frills, as you mentioned. And what occurs is they set them up to deal with these other issues. And we've seen a decline in conventional stores. So, Mass, you're absolutely correct. If you have a conventional store, like a Portino's or an Extra Foods, you'll see that those collective agreements are superior. The rates of pay and benefits are superior in those than there are to the deep discount, like the No Frills and the Food Basics.
Is that the same with your, thank you, is that the same with your workers, Mr. Diaz, that you represent?
Yes, there's no question. There's different pays depending on the discount stores. But one point that can't get lost when you are talking about recommendations, and I'll go back to Michelle's question, I think the federal government needs to introduce some minimum wage legislation. I understand that governs the federal government, the federal sector, not provincial, but it's about taking a leadership position. What has happened through so many of our collective agreements, yes, our members make more than minimum wage. But when you see maximum jumps, such as minimum wage in Ontario under the Wynne government and Alberta under the Rachel Notley government, many of our members, unionized, certainly non-union, got wage increases. Yeah. So it shows that governments can play a real role here. And so the government, recognizing the importance contribution of retail workers, should do something about it. So, and they should also push the governments to make sure. So look, Paul laid out the history, laid it out well, but there's no question. Workers that work in a mainstream Loblaws will make more than those that will work in the discount stores.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. And we started a $15 minimum wage policy federally about 4 years ago, I think. So even that is a modest response. Here's what, but really, quite frankly, upsetting to me is that I have a food basics in an area of that I represent, Windsor West, that is clearly inferior in terms of the way it's serviced and the way that it's kept and the standards it has. And what upsets me even more is hearing about this wage differential, because the people around there are also some of the workers, and it's also in one of the most disadvantaged areas or challenged areas. It's also one of the ones they know demographically is more diverse and has historical hiring issues with regards to some of the people that are there. And what really bothers me a lot about this is that the stores don't have to have a policy of paying their workers differently. That's a choice. That's a business choice deliberately by basically providing lower services, less customer availability of some products, and on top of that, knowingly have a depressed area compared to some of the other areas in the suburbs, which are actually more affluent, receive better jobs, better products, better service, and that's their business model. It's outright discrimination on some of the poorest and disadvantaged neighborhoods that we have, and it's a policy that they implement, and it's a policy they'd actually build their business on. You wonder why people get upset about this, because the kids and the part-time workers around that I've known, I used to be an appointment specialist for persons with disabilities. They're the most vulnerable in this, and you're right about the hours being set, the lack of follow-up. At any rate, this needs a lot more work than what we're doing in these committee hearings today, because there's no doubt this is a structural discrimination by the grocery store chains on some of the most disadvantaged areas. All you have to do is walk the aisles, walk the stores, see the difference. Why do some neighborhoods get treated different than other ones?
Unfortunately, that is your time, Mr. Massey. We'll now move to MP Gray. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first questions today are for Mr. Dias at Unifor. Mr. Dias, I've seen some grocers and their temporary pandemic paper workers stating that things were essentially going back to normal pace. However, we know that provincial emergency declarations still exist, and while I hear concerns in my constituency from small business owners when they go to their local grocery stores that they're still struggling to find things like sanitizing wipes and cleaning equipment and protective equipment to ensure that they can safely open for their staff and for their customers. Mr. Dias, would you agree that shortages in these items in grocery stores mean that we're not back to normal?
Well, thank you for your question. I am joined here today by Gord Curry and by Carolyn Rice, who are on the ground. So let me turn it over.
Mr. Dias, can I ask you to put your mic closer, please? Thank you.
No problem. I'm joined today by Gord Curry and Carolyn, presidents of the locals on the ground. So why don't I turn it over to Gord to answer your question? Gord.
Just take it off mute. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yeah, so you asked about the shortages, and yeah, there still is. I mean, I'm in the stores pretty well every day, you know, looking around in our stores, and you can't find the hand sanitizers in there, the Lysol wipes, those sort of things. And I keep asking, you know, the managers and that, and they say, no, we have a hard time, we're not getting them, the suppliers can't get them to them. So obviously the pandemic is still there because they're going to places that need it more, I would say, you know, the hospitals, whoever. So yeah, that's a good point. And you know, they don't have that stuff. And, you know, I have a hard time trying to find things like that myself. I actually bought hand sanitizer in the variety store. So, you know,
okay,
that's
thank
where
you.
I had to go. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Mr. Dias, you mentioned that there was no coordination from the federal government to provide essential workers with protective equipment sort of in the early time of this pandemic. Have you heard any concerns from employees at grocery stores you represent that are still having access issues for a consistent supply of PPEs and cleaning supplies to ensure they have a safe work environment?
Oh, there's no question. I laid out earlier on that there really is a food chain as it relates to even the essential workers as to who gets what. So there is a lot of difficulty within our workplaces getting some of the basics. So look, our members are upset. Our members are scared. They have the right to be, but they come to work out of commitment. And like I said, the fact that our members are frequently working in 2-3 different grocery stores in order to make ends meet. It's the similar challenges that we had with the PSWs and with all the challenges in long-term care facilities. We know, of course, that diseases are contracted and it's easier to spread when people are going to multiple workplaces. So the challenges in the healthcare sector are absolutely alive and well in the retail sector, and our members deserve better.
Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to talk about the fiscal capacity of Loblaws. And we know in 2016, Loblaws companies bid and won the BC government's online auctions to acquire BC wine licenses. And though the final bids were not made public, we had heard through government statements in information bulletins they put out in November of 2016 that the auction was expected to raise just under $7 million. Obviously saw the revenue opportunity in these licenses through most of the pandemic and people basically eating from home for months, it's been reported that other liquor retailer sales have been up. Do you believe that companies like Loblaws have seen an increase in sales of wine and profit that was higher than the cost of the temporary pandemic pay during this time?
Well, the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, ultimately, if you look at Loblaws' profits in the first half of 2019, it's small as compared to where they are in 2020. They will tell you quite emphatically, embarrassingly, I would suggest, that their profits during the last 3 months are larger than in the modern history. So they have benefited very well from the pandemic. And like I said, they should be ashamed of themselves for what they did.
Great, thank you. And I see that I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Lambropoulos. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Yes, hi. I'm actually starting to lose connection, but I'm going to try my best, and I hope that you guys hear me. Alors, je vais commencer en vous.
So I'm going to start by thanking you for representing this group of workers who have heroically fulfilled their role during this pandemic that we are still going through. These workers have continued to offer essential services to all Canadians when they could actually have found a way to stay home and get the CERB, but they still stayed loyal to their employers during this period. So as you also indicated, the pension plan is insufficient for these workers. Madam Chair?
Yes, I'm here. Do you have a point of order?
Yes, I'm hearing both the member speaking in French and the interpretation at the same time, so I'm hearing nothing because there's two voices at the same time.
MP Lambropoulos, can you make sure that you're on the French channel? Okay, can we try again?
What? C'est fait.
Yes, it's done. Yes, so I'll continue on. So as you already have found, the pension plan is already insufficient and group insurance is insufficient. They certainly deserve more than $2. My first question is for Mr. Lacroix. How many of your members, or what percentage of your members, still earn minimum wage in their province? How many only get minimum wage in their province? Overall, I'd have to say it's at least 50% of these workers. In certain cases, it's a little bit more than minimum wage, but I want to apologize ahead of time. There was a power outage here, and I managed to reconnect with myself, so there might be issues with the connection. I hope that you can all hear me. Okay, great. So in answer to your question, I would say at least 50% of people here in Quebec, more specifically, I have a percentage of workers, a good number of workers who make minimum wage. And there's one phenomenon that was raised for several years. Every month, 10% of the workforce in our grocery stores in Quebec leave that job to work elsewhere. There's a huge turnover, and 10% of these workers choose to leave every month. And that gives you a clear indication of the fact that working conditions are not good enough. Even if you're at minimum wage or $1 or $2 above minimum wage, the fact is that working conditions are bad and people choose to leave and work elsewhere in other sectors. That's it. Do you have any suggestions for not during pandemics, but during this period of uncertainty, what kind of measures, what kind of conditions should prevail for these workers, and what wage levels would you suggest for retailers? Well, I don't have a definite level of wages, but if we don't do something to make that job of food worker more of a draw, then we're never going to reverse this trend. And there has to be a huge increase in wages. If somebody's making $25,000, $30,000 a year, can they buy a house? Can they have a family? In Montreal, a condo will cost $300,000, $400,000, a decent condo. Well, that's $400,000. So someone earning $25,000, $30,000 a year, are they going to be able to buy a condo? Or are they going to do something better than to live in some apartments where the conditions aren't too great? We're talking about people who won't have to empty out their pockets to go and see a dentist, or some people who need to have a pension plan where at 60, 65 they can retire without having too much financial trouble. We're talking about a decent wage. Decent wage is $17, $25, $20, $25 an hour. It depends on regions, it depends on circumstances, but one thing is clear, the government has to look into it, has to evaluate the situation from one region to the next, and there has to be a structure so that the businesses in this industry give wages and working conditions that are decent for these workers. But saying here and now, is it $17, is it $20 an hour? It varies from one place to the next. Thank you for the question.
Merci beaucoup pour vos commentaires.
Thank you for your comments.
As on June 18, 2020, in a media release, you stated that the extra $2 an hour was only beginning to make up for the historic inequalities in the industry. You stated that this $2 premium should never be removed and that, if anything, it should be increased. Do you have any comments on this?
No, absolutely correct. The average Canadian makes $52,000 a year. So that's about $25 an hour. So the question, and the broader question is, if grocery store workers are deemed essential during the pandemic, then certainly they're deemed essential, period. So why should they earn less than the average wage here in Canada? I see the red marker, which means we're out of time, but there's no question. I stand by my comments.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Dreeshen. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I know that Mr. Massey had indicated about the bread scandal, the collusion associated with that. And coming from a farming community, I just wanted to make the point that even if you doubled the price of bread, the farmers would only be getting a few pennies more. So there is a lot of money made in agriculture, but it's not necessarily made by farmers. And I think perhaps what I'd like to do is to talk to Mr. Lacroix, as far as the Teamsters are concerned. It's been so important, to get the products to the stores, and I know that there were major issues earlier on. I know that I had spoken with a lot of people that were concerned, the truckers and so on. Just simple things like having public washrooms open, places where they could have food pickup and so on. So hopefully we've learned something from that. And I think the other thing that we can look at, and maybe for the grocery people, when we go to our local co-op or so on to pick up our groceries, we see the great effort that is being done, and we see them wiping down the equipment between every customer. We see our little dots on the floor, and people understand that if we follow that we'll be able to continue working together. And I think that's critical. So I'm not sure who it is that kind of initiated some of those things. And I'm just curious whether those were steps that the workers were helping to incorporate, and what other suggestions you might have for frontline workers, whether it be those that are on the grocery line or
perhaps starting with you, Mr. Lacroix, those that are actually getting those groceries and that food to our stores?
Well, listen, thank you for your question. There's one interesting point you talked about trucking, and we drew absolutely no lessons from that experience in trucking. Of course, there are trucking companies that are doing things well and that have set up a structure to protect truck drivers, but that took an awful lot of time before it happened. It was extremely difficult, and we had to keep reminding these businesses that they needed to set up a safety protocols in order to ensure these people's work safety. And some of these truck drivers sometimes have trouble getting accepted to go to the bathroom or go and take a shower in certain places. The situation is resolved, but it took an awful lot of work by the François Laporte and the Teamsters to put into place these types of systems. And there's crisis management. There's a continuity or a contingency plan that has to be set up by the government in order to ensure, and the industry has to work with the government as well, it has to be done before a pandemic or in between pandemics, not right in the midst of a pandemic as we're going through a very difficult situation. Now, as far as the structures that were set up for safety, yes, retailers have done a good job. We have to recognize that. Grocery stores have been attentive and have shown some empathy for workers, but workers also came up with ideas and came up with some ways of ensuring their own safety. And one last thing, just to say that personally, I have seen dozens and dozens of cases where people within the population, clients in grocery stores, are not always aware of the situation, and they may go against the arrows, and they may be too close from workers. They may touch workers in grocery stores. They may touch products for no good reason. So there's a lot of work of awareness building to be done, and that's not just up to the retailers to do that. The government can do it as well, and we can work collectively in order to ensure better discipline, because as I said earlier, this pandemic is the first major pandemic in Canada, but it may not be the last.
Thank you very much.
If I could address that question as well, Mr. Durchin, that early on in this pandemic, said we put together a list with our unions around the world, the 20 best practices for retail stores that include everything you see now. Many of those came from workers, they came from unions, and some did come from the employers. We forwarded that to Minister Hadju, all the employers and all the employers that we represent as the best practices. I'm proud to say that most of them have been adopted, but not all of them. And the other part is that it's not consistent throughout.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to MP Assassi. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to the witnesses for your very powerful testimony. I know I speak on behalf of all my colleagues and Canadians in general when I say we owe a great debt of gratitude to essential workers during these very, very difficult times. Now, even before this pandemic, I think the topic of living wages was problematic, let alone at a time like this where a lot of employees have a lot of concerns. If I could start off with Mr. Diaz. In response to my colleague, MP Johari, you said that your union had received no heads up that they were phasing out the wage increases. I was wondering if we take it back one step further, throughout this process, this difficult process during this pandemic, was management at these grocery stores in touch with you as to how to put in safeguards? It seems to me that workers would know much better what needs to be done than management. So were they ever in touch with you with respect to what safeguards to put in place?
The grocery store chains were certainly in touch with our local unions. They were in touch with my staff that represent the grocery store workers, and my assistants have been all over this. So we have been a part of the discussions as it relates to the workplace, the health and safety of our members, and frankly, the protocols and procedures for the customers. But once again, on the whole issue of the pandemic pay, not once did anyone of the major grocery stores contact our union to say that they were going to be cutting the pay. They never talked to us about cutting the pay. They never talked to us about agreeing on a lump sum payment. That was not done with us at all.
And Mr. Diaz, before I turn to the other witnesses, we heard from one of the witnesses about the number of employees that had fallen ill. Could you give us some numbers as well? Because we're all girding for the testimony we're going to be hearing from management on Friday. So it'd be very helpful if we had those numbers.
We had one of our members pass away that worked in a warehouse. But as we are sitting here today, we have, I believe it's 20 active COVID cases in the supermarkets and 15 in the warehouses. And let me turn it over to Gord Curry.
There we go. Yeah, I can tell you the numbers as of yesterday, and we're looking at about 8,000 members, and this is just in Metro alone. We have 20 in the distribution center, 18 in the stores. Now 9 have returned to work in the distribution center and 6 in the stores. And we did have 1 death in the warehouse.
Thank you. Now, if I could put the same question to Mr. Lacroix. How many employees fell ill?
I do not currently have this information.
Mr. Minima?
We've been as high as 60 active cases throughout Canada. We've had 4 deaths in the retail sector. We've had 2 deaths in the meat processing sector, and well over 3,000 people impacted at one point or another in the food processing sector.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Minima, my follow-up question to you is, you said that this is an issue that you're bringing up at the bargaining table. Given the problematic living wages that a lot of employees are receiving, what is the standard response that management gives you when you raise these types of legitimate concerns? I just want to be prepared for Friday.
Well, I think the thing that they will always bring up to them is, who is their competition? What does their competition pay? Our argument back is that we believe that the system is actually flawed. The logistical system of retailing groceries is flawed. When we are all more concerned about driving lower costs, which impact the Teamsters with the trucking, which impact both Unifor, Teamsters, and UFCW with warehousing, because we end up with warehouses that are fully automated. The system itself, it's very thin margins, but I believe that the very thin margins are because of the design of the system itself to make sure that we keep thin margins. And that's where I think the government has to play a huge role in a living wage, so that if the real argument is competition, then take the non-union competition and you force them into the same situation when it comes to wages and benefits. The union members will receive more benefits overall, they'll receive a pension overall, but that all parts of it. And then the thin margins that the retailers always talk about, I think, is a flaw in the system, because that's where we're driving things to, rather than looking at increasing and improving the lot of life for workers.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all your time, Mr. Assassi. Notre prochain tour, c'est Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Next, we have Mr. Savard-Tremblay. You have 2.5 minutes. Hello. My question goes to Mr. Lacroix. I actually have 2 complementary questions. The first question is, if we look at the past 20 years, industry giants haven't given good conditions to people, and salaries also did not follow suit. Therefore, I think that good workplaces haven't really been implemented, and it might have been difficult to do so. Also, my other question is about a salary increase. Let's say that a $2 increase is mandatory for all grocery workers. We can guess that we could argue that, yes, it is feasible, but the consumers will end up paying the price. I would like to hear your thoughts about this. Yes, this is a classic argument. We don't know how to deal with this issue when we talk about workers' conditions in these workplaces. First, I'm going to answer the first half of your question. If there is an executive order, it would enable equality between companies. So there would not be one company that offers a very high salary and another one that offers a lesser salary. Everyone would have a similar salary and work conditions would also be similar. Now, executive orders can work. In Quebec, we have some industries where orders were implemented and this did not lead to a price increase for consumers. For example, there is a decree or an order for sanitation workers, but it doesn't mean that people who live in Quebec are paying higher municipal taxes because of that decree. I think that this is just companies trying to get away with not paying employees more. And I think that now in 2020, when we are paying someone $15 per hour, really, I think that we've gone beyond that and we need to go beyond that. Thank you. I think that the red card will come up very soon, but I completely agree with what you said and I agree with it. Thank you very much.
This goes to MP Massey. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A report from CTV has 2 grocery store workers in Windsor testing positive for COVID-19. That was public today from the Canadian Superstore on Walker Road in the Dougal Avenue location as well. So if anyone's said that the pandemic and the price of the work is lessened, it's not true. We all know a second wave is coming. My question, I'll start with the Teamsters, allow them to get it, and I only have a minute and a half, so after I finish, so if we can be as quick as possible. Would more full-time positions in this industry also lessen the risk for the public and the workers if there was more permanency to those positions and routine? I'm a PSW by training. Many PSWs have to work 2 or 3 different jobs, and your heightened exposure and the risk of the people you're serving is heightened exposed because you have to hit from place to place. So my question, starting with the Teamsters and UFCW and finally Unifor, is that would a greater stability of full-time jobs improve not only the workers there, but also the general public with regards to safety?
Well, I can begin. I mean, just on the sheer mathematics of it, Mr. Massey, absolutely. You have 5 people coming in doing part-time work, or 3 people coming in doing part-time work, and 1 full-time person can do that job. Clearly, that's less points of contact. So there's no doubt that just on the simple math, it would be better. On top of that, those part-time workers wouldn't go to another employer or another retailer to work as well. So they would have less contact doing that because they have 1 full-time job. And as we all know, full-time pure employment with a proper living wage would keep these folks in better shape all around. To your earlier point, Mr. Massey, of food deserts that we have and inadequate stores, the inside, a national food policy and these types of issues will get us there. But full-time jobs will make a big difference.
Let's move over to Carolyn Rice. Carolyn. Mute.
Hi, is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure, I represent retail workers here in Newfoundland and, people are struggling from paycheck to paycheck. And if they had full-time jobs, full-time wages, definitely, it would be a lot safer for everybody. We have people here in our stores that are going from store to store, trying to get 40 hours a week. It's not a good way to live. They're trying to. We have some of our workers going to food banks. It's not good here. And of course, we live on an island, and right now, we have just joined an Atlantic bubble. And there's people coming into our province that we don't really know what they're bringing into us. And
unfortunately, Madam Rice, that's all the time we have for that round. I'll have to move now to MP Patzer. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first questions will go to Mr. Minema. Earlier, you had mentioned about the thin margins that some of the stores are reporting and about the need for a systemic change. Just for an example, so my riding here, it's 77,000 square kilometers in size. I got something like 140 different communities within their riding here. They're all very small towns. A lot of these individual small towns have their own grocery stores. And the margins are so thin that if there was a mandated minimum wage increase from where we are now to, we'll just say $15 an hour, I've had the vast majority of those store owners tell me that they would have to fire all their employees and work longer and more hours themselves as the store owners because they literally cannot afford it. So how do we address that issue and that concern going forward? You're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Mr. President. So I think that's a question that always comes up when we talk about whether it's minimum wage or raises through a collective agreement. But I think there's a bit of fallacy in that situation too. We hear that each time. We've heard it from small retailers, we've heard it from large retailers. If minimum wages go up anywhere, in the country, we're going to close the doors, we're going to lay off people. That actually doesn't occur. And what actually becomes factual is that people have more money to spend inside their community. So that will generate more income, more jobs. So I believe that it's a flaw in the system that we need to keep margins so tight that it does not allow us to provide proper compensation for people that are doing the jobs. But when we have a pandemic, they were able to. We don't see stores closing. We don't see people going out of business as a result of this portion of it. I do realize the pandemic has hurt people in other areas, but I'm talking about food retailers. And there's a number of research out there that says, look, if I knew that my grocery store person that I see every week could get a decent wage and some pension and some benefits, and I had to pay a couple cents more on a can of tuna or a can of product or for my carrots, they'd happily pay for it. And as you know, there are a number of things that will provide better, more stability. You can talk about some of the things in the small communities that you're talking about, and as Carolyn Wright said very clearly, we have some workers in these stores that are using food banks. So we have to accept that there's a flaw in this system, that we could provide far better situation for the workers that are in there and for those small communities, because there would be more money for them to spend at other locations as well.
Okay, yeah, I mean, again, going to those systemic changes here, do you have any specific suggestions that would kind of aid in that, right? I mean, it's great we're having this conversation, but outside of this pandemic, right? I think because people have been forced to stay home, if they're able to, maybe they're still working in their small town, they're not traveling abroad, so maybe right now they have potentially more to spend on food and those essentials. But outside of this, if life returns back to normal, we're going to be faced with that challenge. And especially when we have carbon taxes going up and different things like that make transit more expensive and the cost of food more expensive. What are the systemic changes that we are going to need? What are some really tangible things we can have that will help?
Well, there's been talk for a long time in Canada about a living wage. I think that's a conversation that has to seriously get some legs, as well as a guaranteed minimum income needs some legs. We're also, in my comments earlier, there has to be a full discussion between what a worker in a store makes and what a CEO makes. There needs to be a full and robust discussion of profits that these stores make as compared to what the workers in these stores make. So I think there's not one quick fix, but there is a holistic approach that needs to look at the logistics of this form of retailing that could provide a better, more stable income, not just for the workers, but for the communities that you talked about.
For sure. And I guess the big issue, again, going back to the small town model, right? I mean, again, it's not that there's a CEO structure within there, right? Because the one person is the CEO, the owner, the frontline worker, the stock person, they're doing everything because, again, those margins are just so small. So that structure per se doesn't necessarily exist. But I guess we're looking for the context of talking about Loblaws, these bigger companies. Yeah, I guess that for sure is an issue.
I would also suggest, though, that even in the small retailers, they are buying groceries from a warehouse situation. They're getting advertising assistance from whether they're a franchisee. There are very few completely independent grocery operators left in Canada. They are attached to a Loblaws, they're attached to a Sobeys, they're attached to a Metro. That's where they buy their groceries from. They're attached to a federated co-op. So there still is a structure. There's very few stores left where it's just a ma-pa true operation. They're driving to the warehouse, buying and selling it in the community. Pardon me. Sorry, Madam Chair.
It's okay. Thank you very much. Our next round of questions goes to MP Erskine Smith. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. I want to stick with the UFCW. When the Hero Pay was first implemented in April, was it communicated? Was that decision communicated to you before it was made public?
It was communicated to UFCW before it was made public. We had conversations with all three of these employers we're talking about today about implementing and how it would be implemented and how we could get it done. So yes.
And did they tell you at that time why they were doing it? And if so, what did they tell you?
Well, there's a few reasons. I mean, they were doing it to recognize that there was a situation in their stores, that there was some risks involved for workers, that were in an unusual situation. There was some employment retention situation. All of these things became a part of the process. And as I said earlier in my comments, early on, UFCW worked with our international allies in finding out what are the best practices in these situations. And the COVID pay, the pandemic pay, if you will, was one of those issues.
And within a 24-hour period between June 11th and 12th, Metro, Loblaw, and Empire, which owns Sobeys, publicly announced that they were canceling the pandemic pay on the 13th. Was that communicated to you in advance as well?
I had a conversation with Loblaws in regard to ending the pandemic pay. They called to inform me that they were ending the pandemic pay. As I said, I was adamantly opposed to ending it.
When did that call take place?
Shortly before that, Mr. Erskine, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact date in front of me, but it would have been within a couple of days of that. Would have been a couple of days of that of them making the announcement.
But the other stores didn't communicate it to you at all.
I did not have any conversations with either Metro or Sobeys.
Who communicated the decision to you from Loblaws?
Their head of human resources.
If you can confirm the date for the committee, I know you don't have it today, but when you have the opportunity, Mr. Diaz, you mentioned that there are workers who are still on the front lines, putting themselves at risk, and that in fact there are members of your union who have recently had to leave work because they've had COVID-19. The purpose of the pandemic pay, as described to UFCW, because workers were putting themselves at risk, has that risk ended?
No.
Well, we all know the answer. We all know the answer to that question. The answer is no. The fact that 2 workers again just got tested positive, and it was announced today in Windsor, is proof positive. Look, the argument is nonsense, and every one of us on this panel understands that. And I will argue they understand that as well. So this had nothing to do with somehow the pandemic over, seeing the pot at the end of the rainbow. This was a decision made about money, period. And so some of the earlier conversations we've had about the impact of higher wages, the previous MP asked about the small community and the ma and pa shop. Look, you can't use the worst case scenario and say that somehow that should be the litmus test for the industry. Paul is right. There's very few ma and pa shops. The overwhelming majority of the grocery stores, urban, rural communities, are owned by large players that are making money hand over fist. So this is not an economic decision that was made on the pandemic pay as opposed to their bottom line, because we know they're making more money now than pre-pandemic. If the money was tied into their ability to pay, then they should be paying $4 an hour because they're making more now than they did at the same time last year. So it's a nonsense argument.
And hypothetical for you, let's say I'm a multi-billionaire. I have maybe a family-owned business that generates millions of dollars for me. That business has earned record profits recently. I've publicly stated, though, that I believe in a progressive living wage. Do you think that hypothetical person would cut pandemic pay?
No, because you would think people would have some integrity. people would walk the talk. Those who are in a situation to affect change and talk about it, you can't talk progressive on Monday and do the total opposite on Tuesday. To me, somebody that would do that is a hypocrite.
My wife was recently on a virtual call with our doctor for a check-in for our 6-month-old, and the doctor noticed that the hearing was happening. He said, these workers are frontline workers just like I am. I'll close there. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to Mr. McNamara, if you could please forward the information that was requested by Mr. Erskine Smith to the clerk, he will make sure that it is circulated to the rest of the committee.
If I could just respond now, Madam Chair.
Certainly, if you have that information.
To the best of my ability, looking through my phone records here, it would have been June the 8th.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I do stand corrected if it's out by a day or two. I'm just trying to dig through my phone.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is, sorry, not witness. Our next round of questions goes to MP Rempel Garner. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe I'll take a slightly different tack. This is an industry that has been in transition and has seen disruption prior to the pandemic. And what I mean by that is we're seeing more automation, we're seeing changes to the last mile of delivery. You've got things like Instacart, where drivers in Instacart aren't subject to, they're not part of a union, they don't have guaranteed hours and wages and stuff, but they're definitely part of the system now. And I get the sense that, what happened here during the pandemic is the decision to close down, let's say, restaurants as part of the public health measures. What that did was it removed a substitute good for grocery stores. So you saw an increase in profit for grocery stores. And I guess what I'm going to start to ask in that context is, as we look at policies to address some of the challenges that have been brought up today by yourselves as union leaders, maybe I'll go back to the comment you made, Mr. Diaz, about the $2 being something that would potentially disrupt or push people off out of CERB. Do you think that, can you expound on that comment for me? Because what I'm thinking is that, okay, you've got Instacart, you've got an increased profit margin here, you've got automation, now you've got the CERB. What are the broader impacts of the pandemic issues in terms of the workforce that you represent? And what would your recommendations be in terms of equity?
Well, first of all, has there been a spike based on the pandemic? The answer is yes. But remember, Michelle, they made $2 billion worth of profits, just Sobeys, Loblaws, and Metro last year, $2 billion. So when is enough enough? So what's with the justification somehow that if we increase the wages, that it's going to have a negative impact on the price of the food? One can argue that instead of $2 billion, if they only weighed $1 billion, they could lower the price of food. So it shouldn't have to be on the back of the worker somehow to maintain these costs. The question that I raised in the comment I made about the CERB, there's part-time workers that are working in 2-3 stores, some based on minimum hours. Some workers would have made more money, frankly, sitting at home collecting $500 a week than working for a little over minimum wage for 15 hours a week. It's simple math. So, did they give the $2 pay for all the honorable reasons? They will publicly say so. But there's no question in the back of their mind they were thinking, how many of our employees will stay home and be better off? So, those are all the things that have to be taken into account. But like I said earlier on, Michelle, I think, first of all, the federal government should come out with a minimum wage, living minimum wage, and put pressures on the provinces to follow suit.
Yeah, and I guess you kind of made the point I was trying to drive at, but I couldn't quite figure out how to say it, which is, with the CERB, was there an inadvertent, especially looking at how we design it going forward, is there an inadvertent design flaw where we've actually got retailers saying, hey, we could use this to our advantage for profit, given the disruptions that we were already experiencing and trying to drive towards with automation? And I just find that such an interesting comment. And I think it's something that we as a committee really need to consider. I guess the other thing I would say is the leaders here, you all represent workers, especially in the processing industry. We saw so many cases of COVID. I mean, I'm from Alberta. The meat processing plants in Alberta were just a hotbed for this. And the system all ties into each other. How do we as parliamentarians come up with a set of cohesive recommendations for the broader food services industry, looking at potentially a second wave of the virus in months to come?
Well, I think what's really important in this aspect is looking at the second wave. So we represent probably 90% of the people that are in the food processing, if you will, industry in Canada. And we went through the situation in Cargill and in JBS, as well as Ole Mill in Quebec, and a couple of Maple Leaf plants. I think what those protocols that were, I don't know if I can end my comments or.
Very quickly.
There are protocols in place. They need to be consistently applied to, and we have to look at the fact that people are going home to their families. These are the bread and butter jobs of food processing and retail. They interlock so much. People are going home to food processors or retail workers. That has to be watched very closely. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. We now turn to MP Jacek. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank all the witnesses for making their points so very clearly. I think we're well armed for Friday when obviously the big three are going to be with us. In terms of your representation of the workers that I think we've all come to understand truly are essential workers, what can we as federal representatives on this committee actually do going forward? What kinds of recommendations can we make in terms of federal government activities? And I just wanted to start perhaps with you, Mr. Meinema. You mentioned that you're at the bargaining table. There's some talk of national health and safety standards. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit on what you would like to see from a health and safety point of view?
Yes, thank you very much, Minister. We have, from the health and safety point of view, we forwarded to Minister Hadou and Minister Ashley early on in the process what needs to be done in both food processing and in the retail food sector. They are good protocols, and I would say union and non-union people alike have adopted some of them, but it's not consistent. I think where the federal government can help in both food processing and retailing is the fact that because there is money available to, whether it's the CERB or money available to the retailers or money available to food processors from the government to help them through the COVID, that they could clearly say that part of this process should be that we're following accepted and recommended guidelines consistently throughout the whole chain. And that, quite frankly, would save lives.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz, you've argued for a federal minimum wage, of course, and presumably an enhanced minimum wage. But as you are aware, of course, provinces actually set their own minimum wages. And I just scanned what they are across Canada and was actually fairly appalled at how low. Yep. It doesn't seem that any sort of federal leadership to date has potentially influenced other provinces to follow in any meaningful way. So how would you see that process going forward? And again, from our point of view as a committee, what kinds of tangible recommendations could you make that might be influential on provinces?
Well, first of all, you have to lead by example. And the fact that there is no federal minimum wage, to me, is, there's a red light right there. Because I look at the workers at airport that suffer through contract flipping, Swissport workers I could walk through, who are suffering the same fate as it relates to scheduling and poor wages. But ultimately, the federal government, is going to have to say to the provinces, and there has to be a broader study. There has to be a better bringing together of the minds, the discussions at the Premier's meeting, of which the Prime Minister will address. And we need to say, listen, we've just lived this, and these are the essential workers. Like, you can't have the Jason Kennys of the world, and frankly the Doug Fords, that the first thing they do when they come into power is say, look, the problem is we're open for business, so we have to freeze minimum wage, who now we know impacts the most vulnerable essential workers in the society. So there has to be a broader discussion, and there has to be a challenging of the Prime Minister to the Premier saying, what are you going to do about this? Because this is a public discussion that's going on from coast to coast to coast. And I believe that premiers that are now who are negatively impacting these essential workers there's going to be one heck of a price to pay. The whole argument about tax cuts for corporate tax cuts, creating jobs. I think we've watched what's happened in Alberta. We're watching what's happening here in Ontario. And I think everybody knows that those are sad old arguments that are going nowhere. But the federal government has to lead by example.
And Monsieur Lacroix, would you have some advice again to the federal government specifically?
Sounds good.
I think that this is good timing in as much as the Canadian population is very aware of the fact that setting up a structure and working conditions that are better conditions for this sector is absolutely essential. People understand that workers in grocery stores have an essential role to play in the Canadian economy, but in our well-being as well. So if the government sets the tone and shows leadership, I'm not that convinced that the provincial premiers will have another choice but to follow suit, because the population is aware of what's going on. It's aware of the fact that without these workers, it would have been extremely hard to get through this pandemic.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. The next round, MP Lemire for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, I'm wondering, with the $2 an hour increase during the COVID crisis, that was a temporary measure. So did the workers that you represent expect the decrease, or were they frustrated? Did they feel this to be unjust because the pandemic is not over? Do you see this $2 an hour increase as a recognition of this, or just a way of avoiding or just seeming better, Mr. Lacroix? I think that it was a recognition by the industry, but the fact that they took it away, that created an awful lot of frustration. And we saw it with workers telling us that they don't get it. They don't understand why they have to risk their life during the pandemic. And the pandemic is not over. I want to repeat that. There may even be a second wave this fall. So we're in a situation today where the management is taking away this money from workers, but the pandemic is still raging. And so people are feeling exasperated with this whole situation. And we see it in bargaining that's starting here and there. We see that workers are more and more motivated to actually go ahead and act and fight this situation. And we'll see how things work out in the next few weeks and months. But one thing is clear. I think that workers have understood, and the Canadian population has understood, and the government and MPs here have understood. All of the speeches are this similar. So all that's left is for these retailers to understand and to set up the right working conditions and much better conditions. We've seen that CERB may have had a fairly negative impact in these low-wage earners and whether or not they would work in grocery stores. Now, do you think that the fact that the CERB is going to continue, is that going to have a negative impact on workers in the industry? Would you not have preferred some incentives to increase wages, for instance, with a premium? Yes, a premium for essential workers, and having businesses take on their own responsibilities, may put more money on the table for workers so that these people who are risking their lives on a day-to-day basis can continue to work without any financial worry. Absolutely, that's the issue. Thank you very much.
And our last round goes to MP Massé. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, let's kind of put some context to this, is that when COVID-19 hit, the grocery store chains remained open. Their closest competitor is restaurants and bars and so forth, other food service, which were closed altogether, then temporarily reopened with new structured models that today are still somewhat restricted. So they had government policy that actually changed the business model in their favor. Just the reality of what it is. And we worked on, I worked extensively to try to get credit card rates lower. Some of that was done. Some of the telcos stepped up, providing freer services or expanded services. And then even Lowe's today, they're continuing with their $2 pay. I think if the grocery store chain made record profits off of this situation, they deserve a special spot and corner in hell for it, because this is the most stressful thing for people to get, is food and substance and having that security. When we go back to those months of even people worried about getting into a grocery store, being in their neighborhood, losing or reducing bus service, public transportation, all those things of basic nourishment, we even saw a run on toilet paper. I'll start with Mr. Diaz with regards to this. So you mentioned it. Do you believe that they're making record profits during this time, that they're actually expanding their business model as an advantage because of the government policy? I'm not faulting what we did and how it was done, but it's led to them, in my opinion, to have a net benefit. And I think it might be at the bottom line for them as well, too.
Well, look, I see a difference between the CERB and the pandemic pay. The bottom line is there's no question in my mind that one of the reasons that the employers gave the $2 was because of what the potential of CERB was. But look, I agree with CERB. There's some pieces of it that I think need to be fixed. But there's a lot of low wage earners that work in restaurants. A lot of the most vulnerable in our society needed to get through the pandemic. So I don't second guess that decision. But what I do second guess is what they did. We know that 80% of all grocery store workers in Newfoundland, 80% make less than $15 an hour. So we know that was about a 20% plus pay increase during this time period.
Can I just, we only have a few seconds, if I could just get on the record, do you think that the chains that you represent, the workers, are making more money during COVID-19? If we have a quick answer from everybody. Yeah.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. The others?
I believe that they are, but I believe that the CERB is absolutely necessary because
no, absolutely agree on the CERB. And then Mr. from Lacroix.
The answer is yes, quite simply.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, that is all the time we have today. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing from the representatives of the grocery chains on Friday. With that, we call this meeting adjourned.
Madam Chair, can I just say one thing? Madam Chair, can I say one thing? It's Gord Curry.
Yes, but we've
just
adjourned.
Quickly, on the dates that you want there, I was called by Metro and Loblaws on June 11th, and it was shut down on the 13th. Those are the 2 days notice we got from Metro and Loblaws.
Okay, because we've already adjourned, what I'll do is I'll ask the clerk to send that information around to all of the members, because some have already left the meeting. But thank you, I greatly appreciate it.
I thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.